People ask me what it was like to walk back into that chamber. They mean it as a compliment, I think. They want the triumphant version, the moment where the daughter returns and the assembly trembles and justice arrives wearing a tidy face. What they get instead is a long pause, because I am not sure I have the right word for it even now. 47 years after my father walked out of that room, and 31 years after I stopped pretending, it had not changed everything about how I understood the universe. The word closest to what I felt, standing at the threshold of the General Assembly of the Vethali Concord on a morning in the 53rd year of the corrective record period, was something like tired. Not the tired that comes from a long journey, though the journey from Callaway Station to Veth Prime is 11 days on a military courier, and my knees are not what they were. The tired I mean is older and quieter than that. It lives somewhere behind the sternum, in the place where you keep the things you have carried so long they no longer feel heavy, because they have become part of your skeleton. My father carried that tired. I watched it settle into him across the years after the Assembly's vote, watched it work on him the way cold works on stone, invisibly, over time, leaving cracks that only show when something finally gives. He never talked about the chamber. That is the first thing you need to understand about Elena Voss. He was not a man who talked about chambers. He talked about routing tables and dry dock schedules, and the particular way the Vethali Concord's senior fleet coordinator, a creature named Sothavel whose species communicated partly through resonant bone clicks that no human translator had yet accurately transcribed, consistently misread Earth's published tonnage figures as indicators of civilian transport rather than military displacement. He talked about treaty subclauses. He talked about the grain of the long conference tables they used in the secondary hearing rooms of the Concord's treaty wing, how you could tell which species had occupied a chair longest by where the surface finish had worn away, because every species gripped or rested differently, and the tables kept a kind of biological record if you knew how to read them. He was a man who noticed things like that, and he believed. I understood this only late in his life, when he had stopped working, and the things he noticed had narrowed to the apartment, and the garden and the long views from the window over the docking arm, that the act of noticing carefully was not separate from the act of working honestly, that they were the same act, done in different registers. He did not talk about what happened in the General Assembly on the 14th day of the third session of the 41st conclave. I was 11 years old when it happened. I know what happened because I read the record later, the official Concord record, not the corrected one, the original one they filed before anyone knew there would be a correction. And because I spent 20 years as a treaty compliance specialist for the Office of Galactic Affairs reading documents that other people preferred not to read, and I got very good at understanding what a document does not say as clearly as what it does. And because my mother told me some of it, in the careful way she told me difficult things, seated at our kitchen table on Callaway Station with her hands wrapped around a cup of something warm, choosing her words the way you choose footing on uncertain ground. What she told me, when I was old enough to ask and she judged me old enough to hear, was not the political mechanics of what had happened. She told me what my father had looked like when he came home. She said he had come through the arrival terminal at Callaway Station carrying his briefcase, the one he always carried, dark composite with the brass-colored latch that he had never once replaced in 30 years of diplomatic work, and that he had set it down on the kitchen table and stood there for a long moment, not speaking, and that what she had noticed most was not the briefcase or the silence but his hands. She said his hands, once he set the case down, seemed to have lost their purpose, that they hovered at his sides for a moment in a way she had never seen from him, and then he folded them together in front of him, and that was how he stood for a while. She said he was not a man given to standing that way. That was what she said. What happened was this. The Vethali Concord's General Assembly, 112 species delegates, the largest federated deliberative body in the known arm of the galaxy, an institution that had been in continuous operation for 417 years, and that prided itself in the particular institutional way of bodies that have outlasted most of the crises they were built to address, on the precision and the permanence of its records, voted, by a margin of 89-11, to formally strike the human military assessment from the Concord's standing threat registry. Not to downgrade it, not to flag it for review or submit it to the verification committee or attach a notation disputing its figures, to strike it entirely. The motion used language my father had never seen in a treaty document before, and as far as I am aware, has never been used since. It declared the human military capacity record to be, in the Concord's formal accounting, a non-document, a filing without standing, generated by a species whose self-reported figures were so far outside the range of verifiable outputs as to constitute, in the Assembly's judgment, not an exaggeration or an error but a fabrication, a fiction. The official translation into Standard Galactic used the word exists 3 times in the strike declaration. Earth's fleet, the declaration stated, does not exist as described. Earth's military infrastructure, the declaration stated, does not exist in any form the Concord is obligated to recognize. Earth's treaty rights, derived as they were from military parity clauses requiring a verified standing force, the declaration stated, do not exist as a consequence. The Assembly voted 89-11. My father, Ambassador Elena Voss, was seated in the human delegation's chair on the floor of the General Assembly when the vote was announced. He had been seated there in that chair, representing Earth, for 6 years. He had negotiated the Davin protocols, not named for him. He always corrected people who assumed that the protocols were named for the station, the old Davin relay station where the preliminary talks had taken place. He was meticulous about the distinction, and I think the meticulousness was a form of honesty he could not stop practicing even when it did not serve him socially. He had extended the corridor access agreements by 14 years through a negotiating session that the Concord's own records described, in the summary minutes, as protracted and technically exhaustive, which in Assembly language meant it had nearly broken down 4 times, and he had rebuilt it each time from scratch. He knew the names of the species delegates' aides. He knew which deliberative bodies operated on consensus, and which operated on majority, and which operated on something between the two that required a separate understanding of how abstentions were counted. He knew the treaty archive the way some men know a physical landscape, not as a map, but as a terrain, with its soft spots and its load-bearing ground, with its false trails and its reliable crossings, with the specific knowledge of someone who has moved through it in all seasons and conditions, and who trusts the terrain more than any description of it. He sat in the human delegation's chair and listened to the vote announced, and when the final count was read into the record, 89-11, motion carried, human military standing stricken, he stood up. He gathered his papers. He placed them into the briefcase he had carried for 6 years in that chamber. He nodded once, to no one in particular, and he walked out. He did not speak. He did not pause at the door. He did not look back. The record notes, the human delegation departed the chamber at the conclusion of the vote without formal address. That is all. In a document that runs to 417 pages of debate transcript, procedural notation, and species delegate commentary, the departure of the human ambassador from the floor of the General Assembly occupies 1 sentence. I have read that sentence many times. My father came home to Callaway Station 3 weeks later. He was 51 years old. He looked, my mother told me, like a man who had set something very heavy down and was not sure what to do with his hands. He retired from the diplomatic service 14 months after that, citing health considerations that were partially true. His heart had been giving him trouble for 2 years before the Assembly vote, something he had not told his superiors at the Office of Galactic Affairs, because he had been afraid they would recall him, and appoint someone less familiar with the treaty terrain. He lived for another 19 years on Callaway Station, in the apartment with the long windows that looked out over the docking arm, and he read, and he tended a small garden of vegetables unsuited to station conditions that he kept alive through sheer systematic attention, and he did not talk about the chamber. In the years when I was growing up and he was home, I learned to read him by the things he chose to work on rather than the things he chose to say. He had a study, a small room off the main hallway, bookshelves on 2 walls, a desk that always had something on it, and in the evenings after dinner, he went there. He was not a man who read recreationally exactly. He read the way he did everything else, as if there were a purpose behind it that he had not fully disclosed, but that he expected the reading to eventually serve. He read treaty history, mostly, and administrative theory, and the occasional monograph on the Concord's early institutional development in the centuries before human contact. He read slowly, and he annotated in a handwriting so small and precise that I once borrowed one of his annotated volumes for a school project, and had to spend an hour with a magnifying lens to make out the marginal notes. He annotated everything. That was another form of the noticing. I went into the treaty compliance office at 26 because I was good at reading documents, and because the posted position came with a security clearance that included access to the diplomatic archive, and I wanted to read the diplomatic archive. That was the honest reason. The less honest reason, which I understood only later, was that I wanted to understand what had happened to my father in terms specific enough to be useful. Not just the story of it, which I had, but the mechanism, the structure, the particular procedural anatomy of how an assembly of 112 species delegates in a federated body with 400 years of institutional precedent arrives at the decision to call a true thing a fiction. The diplomatic archive is not a comfortable place to spend a career. It is a place full of the things institutions were embarrassed to have done and found ways to not quite hide, because the requirement to document and the desire to conceal are both structural features of the same bureaucratic impulse, and they produce intention, records that are technically complete and strategically illegible to anyone who is not willing to read them with the kind of patience that my father had applied to treaty terrain, and I had learned from him. I read the 41st Conclave's records with that patience. It took me the better part of 2 years. I was not, at that point, looking for a remedy. I was looking for an understanding, which is a different thing, and harder in some ways because it does not have a clear endpoint. What I found was this. The Vethali Concord in the 41st Conclave was not a body in good health. The Merlith expansion, a territorial and resource acquisition campaign by the Merlith Collective that had been consuming the Concord's eastern transit lanes for 11 years, had produced 4 failed ceasefires, 2 collapsed treaty frameworks, and a financial strain on the Concord's member species that the senior coordinators were managing partly through strategic optimism and partly through not examining certain ledger entries too closely. The Concord was, in the language of the diplomatic archives, internal communications from that period, carrying more weight than its institutional framework had been designed to bear, and doing it in the dark, meaning without the member species' full understanding of the load. The human military assessment had been submitted to the Standing Threat Registry as part of a standard treaty maintenance filing, one of roughly 40 such filings Earth had submitted over the preceding 2 decades, each one accurately reporting Earth's fleet tonnage, garrison deployments, and industrial output as measured by the Office of Galactic Affairs' own verification protocols. The figures were accurate. The office had verified them. The Concord's own independent audit body, the Vethali Commission, had reviewed the prior 3 filings and signed them without qualification. But the figures, if accepted, created a problem. If Earth's military capacity was what the filing said it was, and it was, then the military parity clauses in the corridor access agreements were operative, and Earth's treaty rights in the eastern transit lanes were not optional courtesies, but binding obligations on the Merilith parties, whose expansion had been consuming those lanes with what the Concord's own coordinator for Eastern affairs had, in a private communication I would not see for another 12 years, described as a deliberate and systematic disregard for the corridor framework that the Concord has, until now, declined to formally acknowledge. Earth's treaty rights, if operative, made the Concord's silence on the Merilith expansion not a diplomatic choice, but a treaty violation. The Assembly could not afford that. Not in the 41st Conclave, not with the Merilith parties holding 3 of the 11 votes on the Eastern Transit Coordinating Body, not with the Concord's finances in their current state, not with the senior coordinator's office already managing 4 crisis frameworks simultaneously, and the 5th one, the Dresh-Palney succession dispute, developing in the background at a pace the coordinator's quarterly assessments described as concerning. What the Assembly needed in that moment was for Earth's military capacity to be smaller than the filings said, much smaller, small enough that the parity clauses didn't trigger, small enough that the corridor framework's enforcement mechanisms sat quietly on a shelf where they could be noted in official documents without ever being activated. The Assembly needed Earth's fleet to not exist in any meaningful sense. And so they voted to say it didn't. I want to be precise about what I am saying and what I am not saying. I am not saying the Assembly voted in bad faith because its members were venal or stupid. The 112 species delegates of the 41st Conclave were, by and large, neither. They were managing a crisis with the tools available, and the tool available in this case was a procedural mechanism that allowed a majority vote to reclassify a member species filing, to strip it of its standing in the registry, to render it, in the Concord's accounting, as if it had not been submitted. It was an unusual mechanism. It had been used twice before in the Concord's history, once against a species that had demonstrably falsified population figures to claim a larger resource allocation, and once against a filing that had been submitted in error by a species whose treaty authority had lapsed. It had never been used against a filing that everyone in the chamber, including the 89 who voted for the motion, knew to be accurate. My father knew they knew. That was, I think, the thing he could not set down. Not the vote itself. He had spent enough years in that chamber to understand that votes were not always about truth, that a deliberative body in crisis will reach for the procedural tool that buys it the most time regardless of whether the tool is the right one, but the particular quality of the knowledge that sat in the room that day. The way 89 delegates voted to call a documented fact a fiction, while the documented fact sat in the room with them, in the person of the man whose name was on the filing. The way the session's presiding coordinator read the result, motion carried, 89-11, in the same formal, procedural register that the Concord used for every vote on every matter, as if calling something a fiction when you know it to be true, is the same kind of administrative act as approving a transit schedule. He walked out because there was nothing to say to that. Because the kind of argument that might have served in that moment was not an argument the chamber had any mechanism to receive. Because if you have spent 6 years working with someone on the terrain of what is true, and what is documented and what obligations follow from both, and then they vote to say that the true thing is not true, the argument that the true thing is true is not a new argument. They have heard it, they voted anyway. What you say after that is not argument, it is noise. He put his papers in his briefcase and he walked out, and the record noted it in one sentence, and that was the end of the 41st Conclave's engagement with the human ambassador. What happened next took a long time. I want to say something about what a long time actually means when you are living through it. 43 years is a figure. It occupies a line in a document. It sounds, in summary, like a reasonable period to wait for a corrected record, long enough to be meaningful, not so long as to be absurd. What it does not convey is what 43 years feels like from the inside of the work, which is, like every other kind of work, budget cycles, procurement schedules, staff transitions, the slow accumulation of institutional fatigue, the particular frustration, recurring and never fully resolved, of doing things correctly for a long time without the institutional framework that should be registering your correctness having any mechanism to do so, because that framework voted your correctness out of existence before you arrived. Earth did not withdraw from the Vethali Concord after the 41st Conclave's vote. That is important. It would have been understandable to withdraw. Several of the 11 dissenting delegates had privately communicated to the human diplomatic mission that they would not have found a withdrawal surprising. And one of them, a Curath elder named Velsari, whose species had opposed the strike declaration on the grounds that it set a procedural precedent the Concord would eventually regret, had communicated to my father specifically, through a channel outside the formal diplomatic record, that she considered a withdrawal to be Earth's right and would say so publicly if asked. Earth did not withdraw. What Earth did was quieter and, in retrospect, considerably more consequential. Earth's delegation reduced its footprint in the Concord's treaty wing from 6 active negotiators to 2. The 2 who remained were, by design, not the most visible members of the mission. They were not the envoys who attended the general sessions or the plenary debates or the public proceedings where the species delegates made the arguments that went into the official transcript. They were the ones who attended the subcommittee meetings and the working group sessions and the documentation reviews, the parts of the Concord's operations that produced no headlines and no panicked quotes and no formal declarations, only records. Accurate, continuous, well-organized records. Earth submitted its subsequent treaty maintenance filings to the Vethali Commission's Independent Audit Office, rather than to the General Assembly Registry, on the grounds that the Assembly's strike declaration had created a procedural ambiguity about where human filings should properly be received. The argument was technically sound. The Commission was not the Assembly. It had no authority to act on the filings in a treaty enforcement context, but it kept accurate records, and the Commission's archives were part of the Concord's permanent institutional record in a way that the Assembly's registry, being subject to the Assembly's ongoing deliberation, was not. The Commission accepted the filings. They went in. They stayed in. They were dated and indexed and cross-referenced with the Commission's own audit work, and they sat in the archive, accurate and continuous, waiting for the moment when someone would need to look at them. Earth continued to maintain its corridor infrastructure. This is the part of the 43 years that I spent the most time in, professionally, and I want to spend a moment on it because I think it is the part that is most frequently misunderstood by people who came to the corrective record period without having worked through the preceding decades of documents. There is a version of the corridor maintenance that sounds, in retrospect, strategic, as if Earth had calculated from the first year that 43 years of unbroken maintenance records would eventually constitute an irrefutable argument. I do not think that is exactly right. I think the maintenance continued because the corridors needed maintenance, because the infrastructure was there and it had to work or it would not work, because the species using those corridors, many of them not party to the Concord's internal politics, using the eastern arm routes for their own legitimate commerce and transit, required the beacon networks and the routing protocols and the gravitational variance monitoring to function, and someone had to do the work or no one would. Earth did the work because it was there to be done. The fact that it also, over 43 years, produced a maintenance record that the Concord could not attribute to anyone else was a consequence, not a plan. My predecessor in the Treaty Compliance Office, a woman named Sira Kell, who had come into the role 7 years after my father left the Assembly, and who had built the filing architecture that I would eventually inherit, understood this distinction. She was not romantic about it. She called the maintenance work infrastructure maintenance, which is what it was, and she kept the records with the same systematic attention my father had brought to the treaty archive, not because she was building a case, but because that was the standard she applied to every piece of work she touched, without variation, regardless of whether anyone was watching. When I joined the office at 26, she handed me a binder. A physical binder, paper, the old kind, which she favored because she said digital records invited the assumption that someone else was preserving them, and she had seen too many digital records suffer from that assumption. The binder contained the complete corridor maintenance log from the preceding 7 years, every quarterly filing, every infrastructure report, every fleet inventory update submitted to the Commission, organized in the Commission's own archival format and cross-referenced with the Concord's published network performance data. She handed it to me and said, "This is what we have been doing. You continue it." She did not explain why. She did not give me a speech about her father or her sense of justice or the arc of history. She handed me a binder and expected me to be capable of reading it. I was. I understood what it was and what it required and what it did not require, and I took it from her, and she retired 6 months later, and I continued it. I continued it for 31 years. I want to say something about what it is to do that kind of work for a long time. Not the work itself, which I have described, the maintenance records, the corridor filings, the quarterly infrastructure reports, the fleet inventory updates that went nowhere in any formal treaty enforcement context, because the registry that might have acted on them had voted Earth standing out of existence. I want to say something about what it requires internally, not professionally, to do that work with genuine care when the institutional framework that should be rewarding the care has declared, officially, that the care does not exist. There is a particular discipline in that. It is not a dramatic discipline. It does not feel from the inside like anything you would name as strength or resolve. It feels like the choice, made repeatedly and without fanfare, to do the thing correctly rather than to do it in the way that would require the least care, because the thing is worth doing correctly regardless of whether anyone is accounting for it. My father had that discipline. Sirakel had it. I learned it from them both, from my father by watching, from Sirakel by inheriting the binder and understanding, the first time I read it end to end, what it meant that she had kept it that way. The event that precipitated the corrective record period was not, in the end, a dramatic one. It was administrative. The Merlith expansion concluded, not through military resolution, but through a series of debt restructurings and transit lane renegotiations that took 9 years and produced an outcome that satisfied nobody, but that everyone agreed was preferable to the available alternative. And the Concord's infrastructure coordinators, now under significant pressure to rebuild the Eastern Arm's maintenance capacity that the expansion had allowed to decay, undertook a comprehensive review of the corridor network's contribution record. The review was intended to identify which species had been maintaining which sections of the network, which sections had attribution gaps, and what the Concord would need to fund or contract to close those gaps. The review was not about Earth. The review was about the corridor, but the corridor's maintenance history was, in significant part, Earth's maintenance history, because Earth had been doing the work continuously for 4 decades, while the Concord's accounting had the work being done by nobody. The attribution gap the review identified in the Eastern Arm's primary maintenance record was not a gap at all, in any physical sense. The maintenance had been done, the network had performed, the corridor had functioned. The gap was between the physical record and the accounting record, between what the corridor said had happened and what the Assembly's registry said could have happened. The Vethali Commission's lead auditor for the Eastern Arm Review, a Mavelith senior recorder named Thasarel, received the review's preliminary findings, and then requested, through the Commission's standard supplemental inquiry protocol, the full history of filings submitted to the Commission's independent archive by any party with a maintenance contribution claim on the Eastern Arm for the preceding 50 years. That request was, in practice, a request for everything Earth had submitted to the Commission's archive for the preceding 43 years. I prepared the response. I prepared it the way I had been preparing every document the Compliance Office produced for 31 years. Carefully, in the Commission's own archival format, completely cross-referenced, with the dating and the indexing and the performance correlation data done in a way that required no interpretation from the reader. The Commission's format was designed so that any auditor, reading a properly prepared filing, would be able to reconstruct the underlying activity from the filing itself without consulting additional sources. I had been filing in that format for 31 years. The compilation I submitted to Vethali was the result of 43 years of filings prepared to that standard, organized in a single submission document that ran to just under 900 pages. I delivered it to the Commission's documentation suite in person. I could have transmitted it electronically. The Commission had a secure transmission protocol and used it routinely. I delivered it in person because Sirakel had preferred physical delivery for significant submissions, on the grounds that it created a record of receipt that was independent of the transmission log, and because I had been doing it that way for 31 years, and because this particular submission felt like one where the physical fact of arriving with a document and placing it on a table mattered in a way that an electronic transmission record did not capture. Vethali received the filing in the Commission's documentation suite. It was a large room, high ceilings, the kind of ambient lighting Mavelith officials preferred, which produced an even, shadowless illumination that I had read about but not experienced, and which was, in person, almost disconcertingly complete, as if the room had been designed to ensure that nothing in it could be partially seen. A long table with recessed display panels along its center. Vethali was alone at the table when I arrived. The Commission's documentation sessions were not staffed, as a rule, beyond the lead auditor, because the Mavelith institutional tradition was that primary documentation review was the lead auditor's responsibility, and that the presence of support staff during initial review introduced the possibility of interpretive contamination. I placed the compiled record on the table. Vethali reviewed the cover index without speaking for some time. The chromatic shifts I had been briefed to watch for, the color patterns along the Mavelith recorder's upper integument that served as the primary register of cognitive and emotional state, moved through the recorder's skin in slow, deliberate sequence. A deep amber settling into something closer to the blue-gray range, which I had been told indicated sustained processing, followed by a kind of recalibration. Then Vethali said, in standard galactic precisely, "You have been doing this continuously." It was not a question. I said nothing. Vethali said, "For 43 years." I said, "The records are dated." Vethali looked at me for a long moment. The chromatic pattern shifted to something in the cooler range, which I understood from the briefing materials to indicate something in the territory of settled attention. Then the recorder said, "The Assembly declared this infrastructure to be without a human contributor of record." I said yes. Another pause, long enough that the ambient lighting, which had initially felt simply bright, began to resolve into something more complex, the way you notice, after a while in a very still room, that the stillness has a texture. Then Vethali said, "The infrastructure has continued to function." I said, "It has." Vethali said nothing further. The chromatic shifts continued for some time. I waited. That was all I had to do in that room, place the record on the table and wait. Everything else had already been done, over 43 years, by people who kept accurate records, because accurate records were worth keeping even when no institutional framework was watching. The moment had not been produced by anything I had done today or this year. It had been produced by everything that had come before. I was simply the one carrying the binder. The Vethali Commission presented its findings to the General Assembly of the Vethali Concord's 61st conclave 7 months later. The findings did not use the words corrective record. That terminology came later, in the formal procedural motion that followed the presentation. The findings used the Concord's standard audit language: anomalous attribution gap, unaccounted infrastructure contribution, filing irregularity requiring reconciliation. In standard audit language, an anomalous attribution gap means the records say no one did this, and the corridor says someone did. In the Human Diplomatic Mission's internal assessment, which I wrote very carefully, it meant the General Assembly voted 43 years ago that Earth's capacity did not exist, and the corridor did not get that memo. The 61st Conclave's response to the Commission's findings took 4 months to produce. I will compress those 4 months because they consisted, from my vantage point, of the kind of institutional deliberation that does not make for interesting narration: subcommittee sessions, procedural consultations, the back-channel work of 112 delegations trying to understand what their institutional obligations required in a situation that had no direct precedent. Earth's mission did not participate in those discussions directly. We attended the sessions we were entitled to attend. We submitted the documentation that was requested. We answered the questions that were put to us in the precise language the questions required, and no other language. The procedural motion that came out of those 4 months passed by a margin of 94-0, 16 abstentions, the rest in favor. The motion formally initiated the corrective record review, the comprehensive reconciliation of the General Assembly's standing registry with the Commission's audit findings, which would result in the formal restoration of Earth's military assessment filing, the restoration of Earth's treaty rights under the military parity clauses, and the retroactive attribution of Earth's corridor maintenance contributions for the preceding 43 years. The review took 11 months. At the end of it, the Assembly scheduled a formal session for the entry of the corrected record into the registry. By the procedural rules governing corrective motions, the species whose record was being corrected had the right to be present. The General Assembly sent a formal notification to the Human Diplomatic Mission, addressed to the senior human representative, inviting Earth's delegation to attend. The senior human representative at the time of the notification was me. I had not sought the posting. I want to be clear about that, because people sometimes assume, looking backward, that I had been maneuvering toward this particular moment for 31 years, that everything I had done in the compliance office had been oriented toward this return, that I had been building toward it in some calculated way, that the work had been a means toward an end I had always known. That is not how it felt from the inside. What I had been doing for 31 years was the work in front of me, which happened to be treaty compliance and corridor maintenance and the careful keeping of accurate records, because that was the work that needed doing and I was capable of doing it. That the work eventually produced this particular outcome was not something I had planned for. It was something the work produced by being what it was. Accurate work in good faith produces accurate records. Accurate records, kept long enough, eventually become impossible to look away from. I was 62 years old. I had never been to Veth Prime. My father had been there for 6 years and had never described it to me directly, but I had absorbed a great deal about it anyway, through the documents he had worked on and the annotations in his books and the particular way he talked about the treaty archive. Not about its contents, but about its character. The texture of the place where 400 years of deliberation had left its mark on the shelving and the reading room tables, and the quality of silence in the deep stacks where the oldest filings were kept. And through 40 years of reading the documents that came out of it, I had built what I thought was a reliable mental architecture of the chamber itself. High dome, tiered seating, the U-shaped main floor, the translation apparatus in the standard delegate configuration. My staff offered to accompany me in full. I told them I would take one aide. A young woman named Issy Hald, who had been in the compliance office for 3 years, and who had the right temperament for the kind of day this was likely to be, meaning she did not require things to be explained to her that could be observed, and she did not feel compelled to fill silence with words. I took the compiled corrective record in a case, not my father's briefcase, which had been in the family storage on Callaway Station for over 40 years, and which I had thought about bringing before deciding that bringing it would be the kind of gesture that imposed meaning on the day in a way that was not mine to impose, that the day had its own meaning and did not need me to carry a prop. And I took the documentation of Earth's corridor maintenance contributions. And I took the fleet inventory reports the Commission had formally received and cross-indexed for the Assembly's use. And I took one additional document that was not part of the corrective record compilation, and that I did not tell anyone else I was bringing. The journey was 11 days. My knees are not what they were. I spent most of it reading, old treaty documents mostly, from the early period of human Concord contact, the ones that predated my father's appointment, the foundational filings where you could see the shape of what the relationship was supposed to be before the 41st Conclave's 43rd session made it into something else. There is something clarifying about reading the origins of a thing after you have spent most of your career working in its aftermath. The foundational documents were written by people who believed in the Concord's framework the way my father had believed in it. Not naively, not without awareness of its limitations, but with the genuine conviction that the framework was worth working within and worth maintaining, because the alternative was a universe where the framework did not exist, and they had judged that alternative worse. My father had not stopped believing that. I understood it, finally, on the 11th day of the courier journey to Veth Prime, reading a transitrite's addendum from the early contact period. The walkout had not been a rejection of the framework. It had been a refusal to perform a farce inside the framework. He had kept the distinction clean. That was, I thought, perhaps the most important thing he had given me, and it was one I had not known he had given me until I was old enough to recognize it. The General Assembly chamber on Veth Prime is not what you picture if you have only read about it. That is the first thing I noticed when the aide escorted Issy Hald and me in on the morning of the session. The documents describe a vast circular hall with tiered seating for the member species delegations arrayed around a central floor, and that is accurate as far as it goes, but it does not capture the quality of the light. The dome, a true dome, glass and structural composite, enormous in the way that things built to last are enormous, not showy but simply scaled to outlast everything inside it, admitted light in a way that made the chamber feel less like an interior than like a clearing. The Vethali sun at that latitude in that season was a warm spectrum star, and the light it threw through the dome was the kind of light that does not belong to any particular time of day, a steady, clear, institutional brightness that I recognized, when I saw it, as the light in which my father had been working for 6 years. I had a strange, disorienting sense of arriving somewhere I had never been, that I had been going toward for a very long time. I stood at the threshold for a moment. Issy Hald stood beside me and said nothing, which was exactly right. I found the human delegation's position on the floor. The seating arrangement in the General Assembly had changed in 43 years. The 61st Conclave had reconfigured the floor to accommodate 3 new member species, and the human delegation's chair had moved from its original position in the 3rd arc to a position in the 2nd arc, closer to the chamber's center. But it was still the human delegation's chair, still marked with the Concord standard species delegate notation, still equipped with the standard translation apparatus and the recessed document panel. I sat down. I placed the case with the corrective record documentation beside the chair. I placed my hands on the table. I looked at the dome. The session was called to order by the Assembly's current presiding coordinator, a Sorvelli senior elder named Vethali, whose species was distinguished, visually, by a bioluminescent patterning along the jaw and upper cranial structure that shifted in intensity with cognitive load, brighter when processing, steadier when settled. The coordinator was settled. The chamber was full. 112 delegations in tiered seating, secondary aides and documentation staff filling in the spaces between, something over 400 beings producing a particular institutional ambient noise. The hum of translation apparatus, the quiet movements of bodies in chairs, the low exchange between a delegate and an aide, the sound of a chamber that has been doing this for 400 years and knows how. The noise was warmer than I had expected. The mental architecture I had built over 40 years had made the chamber colder than it was. The presiding coordinator called the session to its stated purpose. The purpose, entered into the formal record, was the completion of the corrective record review, the formal entry into the Concord standing registry of the corrected human military assessment, the restoration of Earth's filing to its prior standing, and the reconciliation of the attribution gap identified by the Vethali Commission's audit. Before proceeding to the formal entry, the presiding coordinator noted, and this is in the session record verbatim, I have read it many times, that the corrective motion before the Assembly represented the first formal application of the Concord's correction of material registry error, provisions to a filing whose error had been introduced deliberately and knowingly by the original deliberating body, and that the Assembly was therefore taking a step with no direct precedent in the Concord's procedural history. The chamber went quiet in a particular way. Not the ordinary quiet of a session in progress, but the kind of quiet that a room of 400 beings produces when all of them have, individually and in the same moment, decided to stop making any sound at all. The translation apparatus continued its low hum. That was the only sound in the room. I kept my hands on the table. The presiding coordinator then formally read the corrective motion into the record. It was a long document, 11 months of careful work by the Commission, and the Assembly's Treaty Language Committee had produced a thorough one, and the reading took time. I followed the translation overlay with the same attention I had spent 40 years learning to bring to documents. The motion noted the 43-year attribution gap in the corridor maintenance record. It noted the continuity of Earth's infrastructure contributions across that period. It noted the fleet inventory filings and the Commission's audit confirmation of their accuracy. It noted the original strike declaration's stated basis, that Earth's figures were beyond the range of verifiable outputs, and noted that the Commission's audit had determined the figures to be not only verifiable but verified continuously by the operational record of the corridor network itself. Then the motion noted, and this was the passage I had been waiting for, the one I had read in draft form 11 months earlier in the Commission's shadowless documentation suite, and had not allowed myself to dwell on in the intervening months because I did not want to spend 11 months dwelling on it. That the original strike declaration's 3 uses of the word exists in reference to Earth's fleet, military infrastructure, and treaty rights had been reviewed by the Assembly's Treaty Language Commission and found to be, in the Commission's precise language, not a characterization of the filing's content, but a statement of the Assembly's preference regarding the filing's effect. The thing they said did not exist had continued to exist, in every documentable sense. For 43 years, that was what the Commission's language meant. It was the closest the Concord's formal procedures could come to saying it directly. After the reading, the presiding coordinator asked whether the human delegation wished to address the chamber before the vote. I looked up from the table. I was aware of the chamber the way you are aware of a very large space when it goes completely quiet, not as 400 separate individuals, but as a single attention, one direction, one moment. I said, the record will speak for itself. That was all. The vote on the corrective motion was 96-0, with 16 abstentions. The presiding coordinator formally entered the corrected human military assessment into the standing registry. The coordinator formally restored Earth's treaty rights under the military parity clauses. The coordinator formally attributed Earth's 43 years of corridor maintenance contributions in the Concord's accounting. Then Vethali paused. The bioluminescent patterning went very still and very bright, and the coordinator said something that was not in the session's scheduled agenda. In Standard Galactic, rendered by the translation apparatus without lag, the Concord notes, for the permanent record, that this chamber witnessed the departure, 43 years ago, of a human ambassador who had represented Earth's interests in this assembly for 6 years with, in the Concord's own documented assessment, exceptional competence and good faith. The Concord notes that the circumstances of that departure were a direct consequence of the vote this assembly has today formally corrected. The Concord enters that notation into the permanent record without editorial comment and invites the human delegation to do the same. The chamber was still. I did not speak. What I did instead was reach into the case beside my chair and remove the one document I had not included in the corrective record compilation. My father's original filing, the human military assessment from the 41st Conclave's third session, the one the Assembly had voted to strike, the one the Treaty Compliance Office had retained in its original form for 43 years in the physical archive, in the paper format my father had used because that was the format the Commission standard required in the year it was submitted. I placed it on the table in front of me. I placed my hand flat on it once, and then I left it there, face up, visible from the tiered seating, the date on its cover page legible at any distance where a being with functional eyes was trying to read it. Then I closed the case. I gathered what I had brought. I stood. Issy Hald was already standing. I looked at the dome. Through the glass, in the Vethali morning light, I could see what I had known would be visible this morning, because I had arranged for it to be visible 6 weeks ago through the standard corridor maintenance notification protocol that Earth had been filing continuously for 43 years. The leading elements of the 7th Transit Fleet, holding position in the Veth Prime Corridor. The ships were not positioned to threaten. They were doing what the corridor notification said they were doing: maintenance deployment, standard positioning, the work that needed doing. They happened to be visible through the dome of the General Assembly on a clear morning, which was not an accident, but it was also not a statement that was separate from what it was. It was a fact. It was what Earth's fleet had been for 43 years. A fact the accounting said did not exist. A fact that kept doing what facts do regardless of what the accounting said. The fleet was not small. It had not been small when my father submitted his assessment in the 41st Conclave's third session, and it had not become smaller in the intervening 43 years, while the Assembly's registry said it did not exist. I heard what the chamber produced in response to seeing it through the dome. It was not a gasp. It was not a shout. It was not one of the things the translation apparatus was designed to render into Standard Galactic. It was the sound 400 beings make when something that has been technically true all along arrives with its full weight in a single visual fact in a moment they were not, despite everything, entirely prepared for. There is no word for that sound in Standard Galactic. There may not be a word for it in any language. It is what a body of deliberation sounds like when it understands, not as a procedural conclusion but as a physical experience. The magnitude of the distance between what it voted to be true and what was actually true all along. The translation apparatus produced nothing. Some things do not translate. I left my father's filing on the table. Issy Hald and I walked across the floor of the General Assembly of the Vethali Concord, through the central atrium, and out through the main doors of the chamber at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow. The corridor beyond was bright and high-ceilinged, floored in the pale composite stone the Vethali used for public buildings, the kind of stone that does not show wear quickly and that looks the same at 43 years as it did at the beginning, which is perhaps why the Vethali chose it. Our footsteps made sound. The doors closed behind us. I did not look back. My father had not looked back. I understood now, in the way you understand something when you have done the thing rather than imagined it. Why? There was nothing to see in looking back. The record was in the room. It had always been in the room, or it had been on its way to the room, or it had been accumulating in the way that accurate records accumulate when they are kept in good faith. By simply being what they are, continuously, until the moment when the room they belong in has no procedural option left but to let them in. We walked the length of the corridor and out through the building's main entrance into the Vethali morning. The fleet was visible from there too, if you knew to look up small points of reflected light at a distance so great they did not resolve as ships, only as a certain quality of presence, the way a sky looks different when it is not empty, the way a corridor feels different when it is being maintained. I found the bench in the formal garden outside the main entrance, the one the Concord maintained for delegations waiting between sessions, planted with the low, mounded vegetation the Vethali favored for formal grounds, deep-colored, dense, with the quality of something that had decided to be there and intended to remain. I sat down. The stone of the bench was warm from the morning sun. Issy Hald sat beside me. Neither of us spoke for a while. The sky over Vethprime was, I had been told and now confirmed, a color that did not have a precise standard galactic equivalent. The Vethali called it Velameth. The standard translation rendered it as the color of a thing that has waited, though the Vethali linguists always noted the translation was approximate because the concept required a temporal dimension that the standard galactic word for color did not naturally carry. It was blue mostly, but a blue that contained something else, a quality I could not name, and that I did not try to name, because some things are better left as what they are rather than forced into the nearest available category. I thought about my father, sitting in his study on Callaway Station in the evenings after he came home, with his annotated books and his small, precise handwriting, and his hands that had found their purpose again in the slow, systematic work of reading and tending things. I thought about Sirakel handing me the binder. I thought about Thassaral in the shadowless room, watching the chromatic pattern move through something in the range of recalibration at the sight of 43 years of dated records. I thought about the original filing, face up on the floor of the General Assembly, the date visible from the tiered seating. It was still there. It would be photographed for the session record and retained in the Commission's permanent archive, where it would be there for as long as the Concord kept records, which the Concord's founding charter specified as permanently. Permanently is a long time. 43 years is also a long time. They are different kinds of long. After a while, Issy Hald said quietly, "What do we do now?" I said, "We go back to work." She nodded once. She had the right temperament for this, as I said. She understood that back to work was not a deflection or a diminishment of what had happened in the chamber. It was the only answer that honored everything that had made this morning possible, the answer my father's discipline had produced, and Sirakel's discipline, and 31 years of my own. The work had brought us here. The work would continue because the corridor still required maintenance, and the filing still required accuracy, and the records still required someone who understood that keeping them correctly was not optional and not contingent on whether the institutional framework was watching. I thought sitting there about the 11 who had voted no in the 41st conclave. I had looked them up years ago as part of my early work in the archive, not because their dissent changed anything at the time, but because I had wanted to understand what it cost them to be 11 against 89 in a room where the institution's weight was entirely on the other side. Some of them had made formal statements for the record. The Curath Elder Velsari had filed a written dissent that used the word precedent 7 times in 4 paragraphs, and whose final line, which I had read so often I could recite it, said, "The Commission's archive does not share the Assembly's preferences, and the corridor does not share the Assembly's conclusions, and the Concord will be in the position, someday, of explaining the difference to the species whose filing it has today declared a fiction. That line had gone into the archive. It had sat there for 43 years in a document that nobody consulted, because dissent records from failed votes are not the part of the archive that receives attention. And then the maintenance review had happened, and the findings had come to the commission, and Vethali's dissent had been cited in the corrective motion's preamble as a contemporaneous record of the deliberative body's internal knowledge, proof that the Assembly had not simply been wrong about Earth's filing, but that it had been told it was wrong at the time and had proceeded anyway. I had read that citation in the corrective motion's draft and had held the page for a moment before turning it. 43 years. Vethali had been dead for 20 of them. We sat there for a while longer in the Vethali morning, and then we stood up and started walking toward the courier dock. My father had walked out of that chamber carrying something he could not put down. I walked out carrying something too, but it was lighter than his, lighter because he had carried his share of it first, and because the people after him had carried their share, and because the weight of 43 years, distributed across enough people working carefully enough for long enough, eventually becomes something a person can carry through a corridor and out a door and into a morning of a color that has no word for it without being stopped by it. That felt walking, like the right kind of inheritance. The 7th Transit Fleet held position in the Veth Prime Corridor for the standard maintenance cycle duration of 14 days, and then repositioned to its assigned operating area, which was logged in the Corridor Maintenance Notification System in the standard format, filed with the Vethali Commission's archive, and entered into the Concord's network performance record under Earth's attribution, which was now, as it had always physically been, the correct one. The record was corrected, the fleet was in the corridor, the filing was on the floor of the Assembly, my father's name was in the document. That was all it had ever needed to be. It had just taken 43 years and a very great deal of careful work to get it there.